The 41 bushels had confirmed the causal. Walter's son Howard had taken over primary management of the Frick farm in the mid-1980s, when Walter's age and the farm's increasing scale had made the transition both practical and planned. Howard had been working alongside his father since he was 15 years old and had learned the calibration methodology in the way that children learn everything on working farms. Not in a classroom, not from a manual, but from standing beside the person who knows how to do it and watching the specific sequence of actions that produce the result that the person and the method together produce. He had done his first solo calibration run in the spring of 1978, when Walter had stood at the field edge with the service log, while Howard ran the catch and weigh sequence on all 12 rows. Walter had confirmed each row's reading against the target before Howard moved to the next. The process had taken an hour and 40 minutes, slightly longer than Walter's solo time, because Howard was building the specific feel for the sequence that only repetition produces and that repetition was in its early stages. Howard had said, after the 12th row's confirmation, every year. Walter had said, every year, before the first field pass of the planting season. Not after the first pass, when you have already planted 200 acres at whatever rate the unchecked metering produced. Before. Howard had said, what if the numbers are fine? Same as last year, no reason to think anything has changed. Walter had said, then the calibration takes an hour and you have confirmation. If the numbers are not fine and you find it in the calibration, the hour saved you from planting 200 acres at the wrong population. The hour is cheap insurance against the loss of a season's yield potential. Howard had said, what was the worst you ever found in the calibration? Walter had said in 1969, the third position on the left side had developed a metering disc wear pattern over the winter that I had not caught in the fall service. The dial said 44 pounds per acre. The catch and weigh showed 31. If I'd planted on the dial setting, I would have planted the left half of every field at 70% of target population. In a normal year, that would have cost me 8 to 12 bushels per acre on the affected half. In a good year, more. Howard had said, you caught it in the calibration. Walter had said, I caught it in the calibration because I do the calibration. If I did not do the calibration, I would have found it in the yield, which is a more expensive discovery. Howard had maintained the calibration practice from his first solo season in 1978, through his retirement of the 1968 drill in the mid-1990s and the replacement's first calibration season and all the seasons that followed. The service log that Walter had started in 1958 for the first drill had been the model for every log that followed. The same sections, the same format, the calibration record a permanent presence in the log structure because Walter had made it a permanent presence from the beginning, and Howard had continued it without the question of whether to continue it. The Van Wert JD dealership had changed ownership twice since 1974. The salesman from the March 1974 parts counter-encounter had retired in the early 1990s, and the specific memory of the rusty drill and the parts counter conversation had faded into the general background of his 30-year career. But the modification he had made to his sales presentation after the 1974 yield confirmation, the practice of asking about the calibration practices of the current equipment before making the argument for replacement, had persisted in his sales approach through the remainder of his career, the specific adjustment that a correcting experience had introduced into a professional framework that had previously not included it. He had mentioned this once at a dealer association retirement function in the early 1990s to a colleague who had asked him what the most useful thing he had learned in 30 years of farm equipment sales was. He had described the 1974 encounter at the parts counter and the 41 bushel confirmation at the elevator, and had said, I learned that the surface of the equipment tells you what the equipment looks like. The calibration record tells you what the equipment does. They are not the same information, and the second is more important than the first. His colleague had asked, "Who taught you that?" He had said, "An old man with a rusty seeder." The old man had been 61 years old in 1974. He had farmed the Van Wert County ground through the 1970s and the farm crisis of the early 1980s and the recovery years of the mid-1980s, and had turned the operation over to Howard in a planned transition that had left the Frick farm in the position that 40 years of Walter's discipline had built, 240 acres, accumulated through 3 acquisitions since the 1960s, all paid for. The equipment fleet maintained to the service log standard that every machine on the farm had been maintained to since Walter had introduced the standard to the operation in the years after he returned from Korea in 1953 and had taken over from his father. He had died in 1992 at 79 in the farmhouse that the Frick family had been living in since the 1890s, with the service logs in the equipment shed and the farm account in the filing cabinet and the farm in Howard's management and the calibration practice continuing into the spring of that year and every spring after. The 1951 grain drill was somewhere in Paulding County, in the young farmer's operation that Walter had sold it to in 1985. The service log had gone with it. Whether the log had survived the change of hands and the subsequent decades was not something Walter had known, and not something Howard knew. What they knew was that the log had been complete and had been given to the buyer who had read the 1974 annotation at the Frick farm gate and had understood what it meant. The equipment goes to the buyer who will use it. The log goes with the equipment. The log is the equipment's history. The history is the evidence of what produced the outcomes that the farm account recorded in the income columns for 28 seasons of Van Wert County planting. The evidence was in the log. The log was in the buyer's hands. The buyer had read the October 1974 annotation. The annotation had said 41 bushels, seeding rate confirmed, calibration maintained. The salesman had laughed at the rusty seeder. The seeder had planted double. That was the whole account. That was sufficient. That was everything. The calibration continued into the next generation, without interruption. That was what the rusty surface had contained. Not rust, precision, 28 years of it documented without a gap. The specific mechanics of the catch and weigh calibration method that Walter had been applying since 1958 deserved a fuller account than the general description could provide, because the method's precision was the foundation of the story's outcome, and because the method itself was not complicated. It was simply the application of the specific attention that produced accurate knowledge about what the machine was doing, rather than what the machine's dial said it was doing. And the distinction between those two things was the distinction between the 41 bushel yield and the county average of 28. The catch and weigh method worked as follows. At the beginning of each planting season, before the first full field pass, Walter would park the drill on a flat surface and place collection bags over the seed tubes of each row position. He would disengage the seed discs from the soil. The drill would need to be on hard ground or elevated slightly so the discs were not loading against earth, and would turn the drill's drive wheel through a measured number of rotations corresponding to a known distance, typically the equivalent of 12 to 15 feet of actual ground travel. The seed that fell into each collection bag during those rotations would then be weighed on a small hanging scale, and the weight would be compared against the expected weight for that row's seeding rate at the distance run. The calculation was straightforward. If the drill was set to plant at a given rate and the row spacing was a known width, the weight of seed that should come from each tube over 12 feet of travel was a calculable number. If the measured weight matched the calculated number within 2%, the row was correctly calibrated. If the measured weight differed by more than 2%, the metering unit required adjustment. The rate dial the tension spring on the seed disc, or in cases like the 1969 third position failure, the worn component that was causing the metering disc to deliver less seed per revolution than the dial specified. Walter had learned this method from a Van Wert County Extension Bulletin published in 1957, the year before he bought the 1951 drill, and had applied it from the drill's first season at the Frick farm. The bulletin had described the method for confirming planting equipment calibration and had included the calculation tables for common seed varieties at standard row spacings. Walter had kept the bulletin in the same filing cabinet as the service log, the reference document alongside the record of its application. By 1974, he had been applying the method for 16 years without missing a season, and the accumulated calibration records in the service log showed the year-by-year history of what each row position had actually been metering versus what the dial had specified. The history was instructive in a specific way. In 12 of the 16 seasons, the calibration had confirmed the dial settings within the 2% tolerance, and no adjustment had been required. In 4 seasons, 1961, 1965, 1969, and 1972, the calibration had found a discrepancy requiring investigation and correction. In each of those 4 seasons, the investigation had identified a specific mechanical cause: a worn metering component, a shifted spring tension, a seed tube partial blockage in 1972 that was not visible from outside the tube and would not have been identified without the catch-and-weigh discrepancy triggering the inspection. 4 seasons in 16, where the calibration had caught something the dial would not have reported. 4 seasons where the planting would have proceeded at an incorrect population if the calibration had not been done. The population error in each of those seasons, left uncorrected, would have produced a yield outcome that Walter estimated at between 5 and 15% below the yield that the confirmed calibration produced, depending on the severity of the discrepancy and the weather conditions of the affected season. In 1974, the weather conditions had been favorable enough that a 5 to 15% population discrepancy would have been visible in the yield differential between the affected fields and the correctly planted fields if there had been incorrectly planted fields. There were not, because the calibration had confirmed all 12 rows at the target specification and the planting had proceeded at the confirmed rate. The 41 bushel yield was the yield that the confirmed rate had produced in favorable conditions. Whether a discrepancy would have been present in 1974 without the calibration was not something Walter could know. The 3rd row bearing had been replaced, and the replacement had been confirmed, but the other 11 rows had also been confirmed that season as part of the standard protocol, not specifically because Walter expected any of them to be off. He had mentioned this to Howard in one of the kitchen table conversations that had been the format of the operation's knowledge transmission. Across the years, Howard was learning the farm's management. He had said, "You cannot calibrate only the rows you expect to be wrong. You calibrate all 12 every season, because the rows you do not expect to be wrong are the rows where the wear is accumulating below the level you can see without measuring. By the time a row is far enough off to see without measuring, you have already planted several acres at the wrong rate. The measurement finds it at the start, not after." Howard had said, "So the whole value of the calibration is that it finds the thing you did not expect." Walter had said, "The expected problems you would catch in the pre-season service inspection. The calibration catches the problems between the service inspection and the planting. The wear that is inside the metering unit, invisible from outside, producing a result that the dial cannot detect because the dial does not measure what the machine is doing. The dial measures what you have told the machine to do. The calibration measures what the machine is actually doing. Those are different things." Howard had written this in the farm account margin beside the 1978 entry, the year of his first solo calibration run. The principle alongside the number, the same practice that every farm family in these accounts had used to preserve the knowledge that the number's context required. The account's margin said, "The dial measures the instruction, the calibration measures the result." The salesman at the Van Wert dealership had been selling precision planting equipment on the promise of better seed-to-soil contact. The precision planting equipment delivered what it promised when it was correctly set up and correctly calibrated. The 1951 drill delivered what its calibration produced when the calibration was correctly done. The difference between the new equipment's promise and the old equipment's performance was not the equipment. It was whether the discipline of the calibration was applied to whatever equipment was being used. A new drill that was sold on the promise of better precision and then operated for 3 seasons without calibration verification was not a precision planting tool. It was a dial-setting tool, and the dial-setting tool's performance was determined by what the dial happened to be producing at the metering unit level, which could differ from the dial specification by the amount that 3 seasons of metering disc wear and spring tension shift had accumulated without measurement. The new drill's precision was the theoretical precision of a correctly calibrated unit, not the actual precision of the specific unit on the specific farm in the specific season. Walter's 1951 drill's precision was the actual precision of a unit confirmed by catch-and-weigh measurement every season since 1958. The theoretical and the actual were not the same thing. The salesman had been selling the theoretical. Walter had been farming the actual. The 41 bushel yield was the actual expressing itself in favorable conditions. The community that had heard about the yield in the fall and winter of 1974 and 1975 had processed it through several frameworks simultaneously, and the frameworks had not all arrived at the same understanding. The yield result itself was not disputed. The elevator records were specific. Walter's reputation for accurate record-keeping was well established in Van Wert County, and the 41 bushel number stood as confirmed. The question was, what had produced it? Several members of the community had attributed the result primarily to the season's weather. The favorable June rainfall and the good August temperatures had been county-wide conditions and had contributed to above-average yields across many farms. And the attribution of Walter's result to weather was not wrong, it was simply incomplete. Weather had been one contributing factor. The confirmed seeding population had been another. The soil fertility program had been a third. The specific interaction of all three under the conditions that prevailed in 1974 had produced the 41 bushel outcome. A farmer named Flippo, who had worked the ground adjacent to the Frick Farm's northeast quarter for 20 years, had come to Walter in February of 1975 with a question that was specific enough that Walter had taken the time to answer it fully. Flippot had said, "You run the same rotation as I do on comparable ground, and your soybean yield in 1974 was about 40% above mine on a very similar season. I want to understand the difference." Walter had said, "What was your seeding population last spring?" Flippot had said, "Whatever the drill was set to, I set it at the recommended rate for the variety, and I plant. I have not changed that practice in 10 years. Walter had said, "Have you confirmed the drill is actually metering at the rate the dial specifies?" Flippot had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "I assumed it was." Walter had said, "When did you last calibrate it?" Flippot had said, "I have not calibrated it since I bought it 8 years ago." Walter had said, "Then you do not know what your seeding population was last spring. You know what the dial was set at. You do not know what came out the seed tubes." Flippo had sat with this for a moment. He had said, "And you do know." Walter had said, "I measure it before every planting season. I have measured it every year since 1958. The log shows what the measurement was every year." Flippot had asked to see the calibration section of the service log. Walter had brought him to the farm office and had opened the log to the calibration records. Filippo had read through several years' entries, the confirmation notations, the 4 years where discrepancies had been found and corrected, the 1974 entry showing all 12 rows confirmed at specification before the first field pass. He had said, "You found actual metering problems 4 times in 16 years. Walter had said, 4 times, where the measurement differed from the dial by more than 2%. In each case, there was a mechanical cause. In each case, the correction was made before planting. Filippo had said, in 8 years of running my drill without calibration, I may have planted at the wrong population as many as 3 or 4 seasons without knowing it. Walter had said, or you may have been within tolerance all 8 years. You do not know. The calibration would tell you. The absence of the calibration means you do not know." Filippo had gone home and had calibrated his drill the following weekend in February before the planting season. He had found the left side outside row producing at 83% of the dial setting, a 17% shortfall on the outermost row that had been accumulating since some point in the previous 3 or 4 seasons, as the outer row's disc wear had progressed. He had done the investigation, found the worn disc, replaced it, confirmed the replacement, planted 1975 at the confirmed rate. His 1975 soybean yield had been his best documented result to that point, which was not entirely attributable to the calibration correction. The 1975 season had its own character, and the yield outcome reflected multiple variables. But the left side outer row had been contributing its share to the population for the first time in several years, and the correction had moved the planting from the below-target population that the worn disc had been producing to the on-target population that the replacement and calibration had restored. He had told Walter about the 1975 result at the Farm Bureau meeting in the fall of that year. He had said, "I found a 17% shortfall on the outside row." Walter had said, what was the cause? Filippo had said worn disc, replaced it, confirmed the replacement. The 1975 yield was the best I have recorded. Walter had said, you calibrated before the season. Filippo had said, yes. Walter had said, that is the value of the measurement. You found the problem in February instead of in October. This exchange, or a version of it that preserved its essential content, had moved through the Van Wert County farming network with the efficiency that useful information moves through agricultural communities when the information has a specific and testable application. By the spring of 1976, at least 4 Van Wert County farmers who had heard the Frick yield story and the Filippo calibration account had added the catch-and-weigh procedure to their pre-planting routine. By 1978, the number was larger, and the Van Wert County Extension Office had incorporated the calibration method into its spring planting workshops on the basis of the local evidence that the Frick result and the Filippo correction had provided. The Extension Workshop had attributed the calibration method to the Extension Bulletin from 1957 rather than to Walter Frick specifically, because Extension Workshops attributed methods to their institutional sources, and Walter Frick's name was not in the Extension Bulletin. But the farmers who had added the calibration to their practice after the Frick and Filippo accounts had attributed it to what they had actually heard. An old man with a rusty seeder who had been confirming his metering rate by catch and weigh since 1958, and who had produced a 41 bushel yield in 1974 that the county average could not match. The rusty seeder was the frame of the account. The calibration was the account's content. The salesman had laughed at the frame. The content had produced 41 bushels. That was the whole of it. Walter Frick had not attended the Extension Workshop. He had been calibrating his planting equipment for 20 years by the time the workshop began, and he had nothing to learn from a workshop about a method he had been applying annually since before some of the attendees had been farming. He had heard about the workshop from Howard and had said, good. More people calibrating means fewer low population years in the county, which means better average yields and a healthier farming community. That is a good outcome. Howard had said, "You started it." Walter had said, "Flippo's outside row started it." The worn disc was the evidence that made the argument specific. Without a local example, the workshop would have been a theoretical recommendation. With the Flippo example, it was a documented local result. The community responds to local results better than to theoretical recommendations. Howard had said, "And the 41 bushels." Walter had said, "And the 41 bushels." Yes, but the 41 bushels was my farm. The Flippo correction was the community. The community needed its own version of the argument, which Flippo provided when he found the worn disc. This distinction between the individual result and the community transmission of the principle the result contained was the specific kind of practical epistemology that Van Wert County farming had produced in a man who had been thinking about the relationship between what he knew and how he knew it for 60 years of farming, and the years before farming that had prepared him for it. He had been a precise man in a specific way. Not the precision of a man who controls his environment, but the precision of a man who measures his environment accurately and acts on what the measurement shows, rather than on what he expected the measurement to show. The calibration confirmed the expectation in 12 of 16 seasons and corrected the reality in 4. The value of the confirmation was that it allowed the 12 good seasons to proceed with confidence. The value of the 4 corrections was that they prevented what the uncorrected reality would have cost. Both values were in the service log. Both were in the 41 bushels. Both were in the rusty surface that the salesman had laughed at. The surface had said old. The log had said precise. The harvest had confirmed the log. That was sufficient. The calibration continued. The log continued. The farm continued into the second generation without interruption, without a season missed. That was everything. The farm account's record of the 1974 yield was not a dramatic entry. It was the same format as every other year's entry. The crop, the acreage, the yield, the price at delivery, the total revenue. The 41 bushel number was in the yield column in Walter's handwriting, no larger and no more emphatic than the 31 bushel number from 1970 or the 35 bushel number from 1972. The account did not annotate exceptional results with anything beyond the accurate recording of the result. Exceptional results were not, in Walter's accounting practice, occasions for emphasis. They were data points in a series of data points, and the series told a story that any individual data point could not tell alone. The story the series told from 1958 to 1985 was a yield series for Van Wert County soybeans and corn that ran consistently above the county average in seasons with favorable weather and consistently above the county average in seasons with average weather, and only slightly below the county average in the 2 difficult weather years of 1974's early drought period, which had resolved before it affected yield, and the 1988 drought, which had affected yields county-wide in a way that no management practice could fully offset. The consistency of the above-average performance across favorable and average and difficult conditions was the specific signature of a management practice that was producing the yield potential that the weather made available rather than leaving some of the potential on the table through population errors. Howard had analyzed this pattern explicitly in the late 1980s, when he was making the transition to primary management and was going back through the farm account's full history with the attention of a man who is inheriting a document and wants to understand what it contains. He had plotted the Frick yield data against the Van Wert County Extension Service's published county average data for the same period. A simple comparison, 2 series on the same scale, the visual pattern revealing the consistent differential that the account's individual entries had recorded. The differential had been remarkable in its consistency. In 27 of the 28 seasons covered by the 1958 to 1985 service log period, the Frick soybean yield had been at or above the county average. In 25 of those seasons, it had been more than 10% above the county average. The single season below the county average, 1963, a wet spring that had delayed the Frick planting and had affected germination on the low drainage fields, had been 1% below, a deviation within the range of normal variability rather than a management failure. Howard had brought this analysis to Walter in the fall of 1988. He had laid the two series on the kitchen table and had pointed to the consistent differential and had said, 27 seasons above the county average. The calibration is in every one of them. Walter had looked at the comparison for a moment. He had said, the calibration is the condition that makes the other management variables express themselves correctly. Good soil fertility applied at the right rate to fields planted at the wrong population produces less yield than the fertility program deserves. The calibration makes the fertility work. The calibration makes the variety's yield potential available. You cannot isolate the calibration's contribution from the other variables because the other variables depend on the calibration to express at the level they were designed to express at. Howard had said, but if you removed the calibration, the series would look different. Walter had said, if you removed the calibration, the 4 seasons where I found mechanical problems, 1961, 1965, 1969, 1972, would have been planted at incorrect populations, and in those years where the incorrect population was severe enough to matter, the yield outcome would have been lower than what the record shows. By how much, I cannot say precisely, but the record shows what the confirmed calibration produced. The alternative would have produced something less. Howard had said, 27 seasons of something more than the alternative. Walter had said yes. He had put the comparison back on the table and had looked at it for another moment. He had said, the account is the summary. The calibration is the explanation. Without the explanation, the summary is just numbers. With the explanation, the summary is a management record. Howard had filed the comparison alongside the farm account in the filing cabinet, the 2 data series on the same sheet, the visual pattern clear, the kitchen table conversation preserved in the margin note Howard had added to the comparison sheet. The calibration is the explanation. That was the kitchen table's teaching, expressed in the margin of a data comparison that a son had brought to a father in the fall of 1988, and that the father had received with the specific attention of a man who has been keeping the record for 30 years and who is being shown, for the first time, the full shape of what the record contains. The shape was consistent, disciplined, above average, documented. That was what the rusty cedar had produced when correctly calibrated across 28 seasons. That was what the salesman had laughed at in March of 1974. That was what the 41 bushels had answered. The answer was in the log. The log was in the filing cabinet. The filing cabinet was on a farm that had been producing above-average yield since 1958, since before the salesman was selling new drills, since before the community had formed its opinion of the rusty implement on the flatbed trailer, since the first spring that Walter Frick had parked the 1951 drill on flat ground and hung the collection bags and turned the drive wheel and weighed what came out and compared it to what was supposed to come out and found that the 2 numbers agreed and planted on the confirmed measurement. Since then, every season since then, without a single missed year, that was the whole account. That was sufficient.